Well, hello. Thank you again for everyone for joining us. Today is Tuesday. It's June 18, and doesn't the time just fly by? We are already halfway through the year. I wanted to show just a few minutes of Carolyn Glick, something she said, because I want to get Avner Bosky, who's on with us today. We really appreciate him a lot. I want to get his thoughts on this. Now, I had heard this a while ago, but then just noticed it's coming up again now. For example, this is the text thread. I think it was Connie Wilson that got us all in this text thread. But it says here, newly surfaced documents reveal that the IDF and intelligence systems had detailed knowledge of Hamas's plan to raid Israel and kidnap 250 people weeks before the October 7 massacre. And then Carolyn Glick, if you haven't heard of her, she's got some chutzpah and she's also got some wisdom. But just listen to a couple minutes of her show a couple days ago.
The army is going to fall apart. Well, small wonder that Hamas figured it was okay to invade, right? So that's what Herzl Halevi did in the lead up to the invasion. But that, of course, isn't all that he did. We found out after October 7th that officers, intelligence officers, and NCOs in the year and then the months preceding October 7th, 2023, had intercepted Hamas's invasion plans of Israel. And it had everything in there. Everything in there. It was called something like the Walls of Jericho or something like that. And it was ignored. And the information about this Hamas plan was never relayed to the government, not to the defense minister, not to the prime minister. They were never told that the IDF had this information about Hamas's intention, its plan, its training operations towards carrying out the Walls of Jericho operation, what we dubbed the Walls of Jericho operation, and invading Israel. And that's not all. That's not all. On October 6th, as we know, beginning at midnight, there were 2 conference calls that Herzl Halevi participated in that were giving updates, making very clear that Hamas was planning an invasion. And who didn't he inform? That's right. He didn't inform the government. He didn't inform Netanyahu. He didn't inform Gallant. They were not told at midnight. They were not told at 4 o'clock in the morning that the army and the Shabak were picking up very clear signs of an impending invasion of southern Israel from Gaza along multiple points. The first that they heard of it was at 6:29 when the border was breached. And they're not the only people that he didn't tell. He didn't tell the Gaza division. He didn't tell Golani division, who soldiers were there asleep. And they weren't told even to wake up for dawn guard. Okay, they were killed, they were decapitated in their beds. The same thing with the female soldiers who were manning the computer screens that had all of the photographs of the border.
Okay, so who she's speaking of there is the chief of staff for the IDF, who, interesting, the Jerusalem Post just said was the worst chief of staff they said that's ever in the history of the IDF. But I want to get Avner Bosky's thoughts on this, and so as well as the other things that you have to share with us, just because this is, I'm obviously there's lots to just pray about right now in the ongoing war today, right now, Hezbollah, Hamas. But what's your thoughts on this, Avner? Because this is pretty serious, and this is very significant for the nation. Over to you.
Sure. Well, there's a term, it says a specialist is someone 50 miles away from home, or kilometers, if you prefer. And one of the things that goes on with Israel is that we're all specialists. And sometimes some of the things we say are true. So Carolyn Glick, who is a very courageous woman, she's like a Deborah. At the same time, there's a couple of things where she spun things in what she just said, where she used true pieces of information and then drew conclusions and put it all together. And there's no way to know whether she's totally right or wrong unless you do a lot of research. It's the whole thing of gold not being found on the surface. So to use an illustration that some people in Canada may know about, there was a long time ago, like in 1945, a cipher clerk at the Soviet embassy. His name was Igor Sergeyevich Guzenko. And he actually defected right after 2 or 3 days after World War II. And he brought huge amount of information which showed both American and Canadian intelligence that they were totally penetrated by Soviet counterintelligence. And what happened is people didn't want to believe him. Mackenzie King said, no, it's impossible. And he was hidden, and they didn't believe him for quite some time, even though he came with all the information. Now, if I wrote about that at the time, which of course I couldn't have under the Official Secrets Act in Canada, but if I had written at the time and said, here, Canada doesn't care about Russia, Canada doesn't know anything about Russia, Canada was deceiving the Canadians about Russia, I would say that's probably overstating the case. So if we look at what Carolyn is saying, Carolyn is pointing out some good things, and she's drawing some conclusions which are actually not correct, all at the same time. So therefore, it means one has to think and weigh, even if it's Carolyn or even if it's Avner, doesn't matter who says what, one has to be careful about these things. So back in 1973, 50 years and 1 day before the October 7th invasion, there was an all-out attack on Israel using 23 different countries, including Russian, North Vietnamese pilots, Cubans, you name it, they were against us in the 73 war. It turns out that there were various strands or streams of intelligence at that time, and all this is, again, open source stuff, including the son-in-law of President Anwar Sadat in Egypt, who had smuggled out the entire order of battle and got it. He met with Zvi Zamir, the head of the Mossad in London, a few days, 2 days before the war. There were all kinds of information which the Mossad had, but there was some guy, a very courageous, brave soldier who was head of Army intelligence, who refused to accept any of that information. And it was a fight between Moshe Dayan and the head of Israeli intelligence, Amman it's called, and the Mossad. And they disagreed in terms of the advice they gave to Golda Meir. Golda Meir, was trying to do the right thing, but when her generals argued, what are you supposed to do? And so what happened is Israel was not really ready for the 73 war because there was something called a conception or a conceptia in Hebrew that Egypt was not ready to go to war. But the signs and signals were so very, very, very clear. So were the signs and signals very, very clear here? Among some people, yes. Among everybody, not necessarily. Was the conception that Hamas would not do this? Yes. The head of intelligence, military intelligence, didn't believe that. Many high top brass in military intelligence didn't believe that. So in that sense, what Carolyn Glick is saying is true. On the other hand, there were a lot of things from observation tower observers, 8200, which is our signals intelligence group, who was seeing things. There were all kinds of things that were pushed aside. So it's the next question. Were they pushed aside because of the fact that the heads of military intelligence of Israel wanted this to happen? That would be a conspiracy theory. I don't think that's true. Were they pushed aside because some military leaders are arrogant sons of fathers who don't care about listening carefully to advice that doesn't fit their preconceived conception? Yes. And so that's kind of what happened. So she is saying that everybody knew and they ignored it. that is actually a little bit tendentious and
Mm,
it's a little bit propagandistic, but it's based on some facts which she is using, which are true facts. So
mm,
if she wanted my advice, and we've never met, I would say be a little more careful because when you besmirch everybody totally,
mm,
you may not be 100% accurate. You're only partially accurate.
mhm.
And so that's how I would generally respond to that. That yes,
Okay.
people who needed to know did know, and they ignored it for the most part because of their own arrogance. And
Wow.
God is involved in these things. You know, there are cases where Israel,
Mm,
because of Saul's leadership, didn't succeed, or even when David sinned. But if somebody
mm.
were here screaming at David, they would maybe also miss a few points as well.
Right, gotcha. Well, I think it was also clear that this group, he's part of it, really hated Netanyahu, or still does. But anyway,
Most people hate Netanyahu. That's also true. And some
okay.
of it is probably deserved, and some of it is not deserved. Um, listen, in the days of Trudeau, a lot of people hated Trudeau, but if you ask who was Robert Stanfield, very few people would remember who he was.
Right, right, right. Okay, there you go. My neighbor keeps me informed, and he's Jewish and he's an American. He keeps me informed on what Trudeau's always doing.
Oh,
Hey, quick.
I meant the father. I meant the father. I'm from a
Okay.
different generation.
Gotcha, gotcha. Wait, before you carry on, fun fact, because you mentioned Moshe Dayan. He gave my grandfather this gold coin from Israel. So there's interaction from Moshe. Here's the letter from his assistant, General Dayan,
Equivalent.
to my grandfather because he was a righteous Gentile, helping the Jewish people in the war in the Netherlands during the Nazi occupation. Anyways, that's a fun fact for you. All
That's
right,
wonderful. That's
go
wonderful.
carry on, carry on. What have you got to share with us today to pray into?
Well, two things I thought which would be helpful, and they're more philosophical because sometimes there's so much going on. I was talking with my family last night, and what we all agreed we're used to things, you know, bad news or traumatic news or sobering news once a month, once a year.
Mhm.
But now it's coming out once a day,
Yeah, right.
all over the world, and that's a new
Yeah.
dynamic, and it indicates that we're in a new season.
Mm,
So it means we need to think and not say, "Oh my, let's put the genie back in the bottle." It's
mm.
not going back in the bottle, and that's for the whole world, including that paradise on earth known as Canada. Um, and so, one of the things to think about with Israel, because Israel is so much, very much in the news, is that the Bible happens to talk about Israel and not so much about Canada. Even on
True.
the Canadian coat of arms, they quote, I believe it's Psalm 79 or 73 or something like that. And that's
72.
72. And that's about Israel. It's not about Canada. It
Hmm.
was a replacement theology perspective. So one good thing is no matter how bad it gets about with Israel, there are scriptures that we need to know and remember because they can encourage us. Now, some of
Amen.
those scriptures are all negative, talking about God's judgment of Israel and how hard it's going to be. And those are also true, although some would like to
Mm,
get rid of that because they love Israel so much. But then there are other scriptures which are talking about how Israel will be doing amazing things. So I wanted to
mhm,
just mention two little scriptures that may be of encouragement. The first one is Ezekiel 37, and
mhm,
I have it here,
mhm.
and I have to get it closer to my face here. So it says in Ezekiel 37, verse 11, and this is, of course, quoted in the Israel national anthem. Our anthem is called Hatikva, the hope.
Right.
And we have a line there, Od lo avda tikvatenu, and it comes from verse 11. And he said to me, this is the Lord, the Spirit of the Lord, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. So he's saying the dry bones is not a replacement theology thing. It's not a pastor to preach on when his congregation didn't behave well the week before. It's the Jewish people. He said, they indeed say, our bones are dry, our hope is lost. That's the line in the Israeli national anthem, but instead of saying our hope is lost, we say our hope is not yet lost. And we ourselves are cut. Therefore prophesy and say to them, this is what Yahweh God says, behold, O my people, I will open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves and bring you into the land of Israel. And then you shall know that I am the Lord when I have opened your graves. So he says, then I will put my spirit in you and you will live. So one has a focus there in verse 10, 11 through 14, where he says, I'm bringing you back by the Spirit. That's the good news. But you don't know it. And then I'm going to give my Spirit to you. So as a general, if you'd like, overview, that's where we are. God is bringing us back by his Spirit. So people say, how can God do that? They're not believers. Well, God says he's going to do that. And then he says, I'm going to put my Spirit in you. So that is something to be praying about. I know people whose names I forget, but they always talked about praying the scripture.
Yeah.
And said, these scriptures, these prophecies are invitations, not to be passive, not to get out the remote control, but to say, okay, if you're going to do that, God, where are we in that schedule? How can I be praying about that? So that's point one. Point two is in Malachi. At the very end, it's actually the last verse of what's known by most people today as the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. It says, behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of Yahweh, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the earth with a curse. Very positive last word in the Bible, curse. And so for most Jewish people, or Orthodox people, they say, we can't end up reading the Bible and saying curse. So then they put in another verse again and say blessing. But it does end with the word curse. So he's saying here, there's a calling on the Jewish people that the children's hearts should be turned to the fathers and the fathers' hearts to the children. This goes over very well on Father's Day too, because God is saying, I want to restore not only the Jewish generations to each other, but I would even apply it and say we need to get turned back to the patriarchs and the promises made to those fathers as well. And so what he's saying is, when you have generations in Israel screaming in the streets and cursing Ben-Gurion, now you say, wait a second, how are they cursing Ben-Gurion? Well, Ben-Gurion's most important book for him was the Bible. And he believed that the Jewish people are coming back to the land in fulfillment of the promise of Ezekiel 37. And so he'd be considered today by a lot of these demonstrators as a messianist. They're using that as a swear word, messianics. They don't mean the Jewish believers in Yeshua. They mean those who believe in the Old Testament hope of Israel being restored to their land. So the demonstrators today, who are not the majority by any means of the people, but they're cursing the patriarchal promises, and they're calling these people terrible people and primitive people, and they're hanging up banners around Israel. Money comes from outside the country. You can read about some of the newsletters I've written, but they're saying, enough of the messianists and the zealots. By that, they mean those who believe that God is restoring the Jewish people to the land. So this is another thing to pray for this verse to come to pass. Boy, there has to be some shaking, because, I mean, again, some Orthodox people are very, they don't care about what the non-religious people think. But for the majority of the Orthodox, they're in great pain right now. This is the second time being taken out of Gaza, the settlements being closed down on northern West Bank. And now people saying, if you believe in Messiah, you should be put in jail, type of thing.
Wow.
So that's something to pray about. You're not going to see that in the news, because the news basically agrees with the politically correct view that anyone who believes in a messianic hope for Israel is a primitive.
Wow.
So this is something that, as believers, it's important to be aware of both points. One
Yeah.
is God is doing this return, and he is going to bring his spirit. And two, that's going to require a shaking of people where they get hooked in again to the messianic and patriarchal blessings and promises. And so those are really important things to pray about, and they totally fit in with the prophetic
Yeah.
vision at the end of days.
Wow, come on. I'm going to